Hoping to claim the Self-Employment Grant 5? Well, watch on. As a business accountant, my team and I spend all day long helping business owners on their journey. As you can imagine, over the past year and a bit, COVID and pandemic support from the government has been a key topic. We've done tons of video, blogs, podcasts on it, and I wanted to do this video talking about the Self-Employed Income Support Grant number 5. Obviously, as it's number 5, there has been 4 grants before it, and they all had their own conditions and everything else, and the timescales to apply for those have gone, so I'm not going to talk about any of that, but some of the conditions in terms of could you get the grant still apply to this one, but I'm going to recap it all in this video anyway. What I should start off with saying before we get going though, is self-employed is a term that Revenue and Customs are using for an individual. So you're either going to be an individual, so you fill in a personal tax return, those kind of things, or you're going to be in a partnership. We're not talking about limited company directors. So quite often many freelancers, for example, are limited companies and would refer to themselves as self-employed. But from the revenue's point of view, you're not. You're actually employed as a director of a limited company. So in this video particularly, and with regard to the grant, we're talking about individuals who are self-employed as far as HM Revenue and Customs are concerned. Now, before I get into it, if you like these type of videos, make sure to click the subscribe button below so you get notified whenever we release more just like it. So let's talk in general about the grant. There's a lot to cover, and I'm gonna do something I don't normally do and give a slight opinion on this, in that I'm not a big fan of this grant. I think it's overcomplicated for most people to work out, and it's fraught with potential risk where Revenue could come back to you and say, actually, we think you've got this wrong, and I'm sure they're putting in many checks. In fact, we've seen it already with clients who are getting certain amount of extra checks that weren't there in the last grant. So I'm a little bit concerned about this one, but I'm going to try my absolute best to explain it to you as easy and simple as I can in a video format. What I would encourage you to do though, if you want to see any detail, is I'm going to put a load of links down below so you can go to the Revenue site and see certain things like worked examples of how they would work things out, because it's quite hard sometimes to picture as I'm explaining it, but hopefully you're going to get the gist of how this grant works. So before we get into the detail around, how much the grant is, because that could be particularly complicated in this particular instance, then I want to talk to you about, is the grant for you? Can you get it? What do you have to do to get it? Because ultimately, if you can't, you might as well move on and watch another video. So in this particular grant, you needed to have self-employed income. So you needed to be in business during the 1920 year, have submitted that 1920 tax return before the 2nd of March, and be intending to trade in the current year we're in now, the 21-22 year. If you've got those things and your trading income is under £50,000, then you're probably good to go. However, your trading income has to be under £50,000 and at least equal to any other income. So what that means is if you're employed in a full-time job and you've got a little side hustle and your job is paying more than your side hustle, you're not going to be able to get any money on the side hustle. It's really for the kind of the genuine full-time self-employed type people, but we've seen some examples of that number being very close. The side hustle is almost the same, but not quite the same, and you can miss out. So if you've got those criteria, you're probably in with a good shout of getting it. Now, Revenue and Customs have said, we've emailed everybody and told them if we think they're eligible. Now, one of the big criteria I didn't mention is, in order to be eligible, you have to have a reasonable belief that you've been significantly impacted by the pandemic between the dates of the 1st of May and the 30th of September. Now, that's odd because we're recording this video early August, so you've got to kind of almost get your crystal ball out and think about whether you're going to be impacted, but you've got to really be impacted and have a reasonable belief and be able to keep evidence that you reasonably believed at the time you claimed that you were going to be impacted in order to claim this grant. And the wording's pretty specific. And I think that's key because right now, many businesses are in fact booming, but there are a lot of people in the creative industries and performing arts, all those kind of things. We've got plenty of clients in those industries that are still really affected and just can't get out there. So, if that's you, for example, you're easily going to be able to say, yeah, well, I've not got any gigs coming up, for example. So there you go, you're going to have a reason. And you should keep as much evidence as you can, because what Revenue and Customs have said is that if you do claim this grant and subsequently it turns out actually you're okay, they're not going to come for you if you can prove at the time you reasonably believed. And I'm going to keep using this phrase, reasonably believed. If you can prove that, then you should be fine. So we mentioned the period there, 1st of May to the 30th of September. So it's around 5 months. However, the grant is only for 3. So they're going to pay you out 3 months of your average trading profit. So if you imagine when you submit your tax return, it shows here's my trading income. So the Revenue and Customs are going to know what that is if you've already submitted your tax return. So they're just going to take 3 months worth and pay it to you. However, they're not paying you the full amount because a bit like furlough, they're going to try and keep it in line. So they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to pay you 80% of that 3 months. However, we're only going to pay you, and this is where the grants differ quite a lot this time round if you've claimed the previous ones, we're only going to pay the 80% if you can prove to us that your turnover, and I'll come back to what turnover is in a minute, and this is where it all gets a bit complicated, has dropped by more than 30%. By looking at, and this again is where for me it's not the great system, is they're going to say to you, right, to work this out, look at the 1920 tax year. So you would have submitted your 1920 tax return, otherwise you're not going to be eligible for the grant anyway. So look at what your turnover was. Now when we're talking turnover, we're talking about the amount of money generally outside of VAT, if you're VAT registered, that you've received from your customers and your clients in your business. If you've done that on your tax return, you'll have put it in a box anyway, so you can pull it from there. Now take that figure and compare it against what you've done so far between April 20-ish, and I say ish, you'll see why in a minute, April-ish 2020 round to April-ish 2021. So a 12-month period. So for some of you, that might be the 1st of April 20 to the 31st of March, or it could be the 6th of April to the 5th of April, whatever that 12-month period is. Take that figure, compare it to the 1920 year, and if you've dropped by more than 30%, you'll be able to claim the 80% grant. Bear with me, rewind that if you need me to explain that to you again. And again, I'd check out the worked examples so you can see it. So if your turnover's dropped by more than 30% by comparing those figures, you're going to get an 80% grant of 3 months worth of trading profit up to £7,500. Now, if your turnover hasn't dropped by 30%, they're just going to give you 30% of those 3 months. So you can see the grant's either going to be 80% or 30% of 3 months worth of kind of money as the tax people see it. So a couple of things, like the other grants, those are taxable income figures. So if you bought a big van or a lot of equipment and reduced your taxable income, which is great normally because you're using all the tax relief available to you, then that's going to impact the level of the grant. They're not taking those things out of the equation. And the other thing I wanted to mention is when you're working out those turnover figures, be sure not to include any grants you've received in those periods. If you've claimed the other grants, don't stick those in with your turnover figures because obviously they're not a true reflection of how your business is getting on. And finally, before I talk about the other points surrounding this grant, is that if you are comparing those 2 years, your 2021 sort of 12 months against your 1920, and you look at 1920 and think, actually, that doesn't look like it's a proper year for various reasons. Let's say you were off long-term sick with, I don't know, some issue, could even be the back end of COVID around then, you never know, but let's just say you're off long-term sick or it's a weird year for some other reason. They are actually allowing you to compare 18-19 with that 2021. So it's quite a difference of time, but they're allowing you to look at those as a reference year, as they're calling it. So bear that in mind if for some reason 1920 is a bit weird. So then how do you claim? Well, like the other claims, you're going to do it yourself online. Unfortunately, us mere mortal accountants cannot do this for you. And in fact, if your accountant is doing it, you're going to get caught by the fraud check instantly and it's going to delay the payment. They've said that openly and they continue to make that thing. You need your own government gateway ID. If you've not got one of those, it takes like 5 minutes to sort out, but you will need probably like a passport or a driving license to prove your identity to sort it out, but it really does take like 5 minutes online and then you've got it. And it's a good chance if you haven't already to maybe get a personal tax account, they're called, and things like this, so that you can log on to the revenue and have communications digitally with them. It's the future. So once you've got that, then you're going to need your self-assessment UTR. That's like your tax reference that's on your tax return. Your bank details, surprisingly enough, because they're going to want to know where to pay it. But you're also on this grant going to need those turnover figures so that you can put them in. And as I say, you can find the old figure, so the 1920 or the 1819 on your tax return. And if you're really ahead of the game and already done your 2021 tax return, obviously you're going to be able to find the figure there. But if you haven't done that tax return, then obviously you're going to need to figure it out from either your accounting software, your pad of paper, your book, add it up, figure it out and go from there. And then you're going to need those two figures. So a bit more homework than the previous grant. And you are probably also going to need your national insurance number. So going back to the point I made earlier though, the revenue may have wrote to you and said, look, we think that you could be eligible to apply for this. So here's where you do it and here's the date from which you should do it. However, you still have to make that decision. Have you been significantly impacted by coronavirus during the period 1st of May to the 30th of September? And if you haven't, don't claim, because they will look at these for sure. So be wary of that particular thing, even if you've been invited. If you haven't been invited and you really think you are due, maybe you've missed some communication. And again, one of the links down below will take you to the site, and you can put in your tax return UTR tax reference and go through the process, and it will tell you whether they think you're eligible or not. Now, presuming that it all goes through, 6 working days is all you're looking at for it to arrive in your bank account. And then finally, one of the questions people ask a lot, and we have seen it time and time again now from the previous self-employment grants with people still being surprised about this, is they are taxable and subject to national insurance. So obviously if you're going to get this big grant, you're going to need to put some of that money aside if you're not going to want to get a shock tax bill later down the line. We've especially seen this if you're in the construction industry. You normally get a rebate, for example, because your tax is deducted almost at source. Then this has no tax deducted at source. It's going to throw that out. So you should really start to plan for the impact of that. The biggest way to make sure that you're kind of there with the previous year is get your 2021 tax return in way before the 31st of January. But obviously you're not going to be able to get this tax return done because this grant goes on your 21-22 tax return, which you can't even do until the other side of April next year in 2022. So for now, you just got to know some of this money I'm getting is subject to tax and national insurance. So for most people, you're going to be looking at maybe 29% of that grant being payable in tax at 20%, national insurance at 9% potentially, but it really does depend on the rate of tax you pay. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And that's it, bit of a longer one today. Apologies, it is complicated. I don't know why it's so complicated, but hopefully this video has shone some light on it. Get on there, apply, but only if you really have been significantly impacted. Please share it with people that need to know this info, and I'll see you on the next one.